and welcome to Dregs of Wisdom with Andrew Tanner.
All right, Dregs of Wisdom, episode 8. We have an amazing guest for you today. My former professor of mine at Harvard Divinity School, Chris Berlin, who is an academic, meditation teacher, and chaplain. He's the denominational counselor to Buddhist students and instructor in Ministry and Pastoral Counseling at Harvard Divinity School. Chris previously served as the interfaith chaplain at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. Chris is also a decades-long meditation practitioner, and he is a lay teacher in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. He has his own online Sangha, which meets on Sunday, Clear Path Sangha. We'll talk about that later. And he is also a musician, as the co-founder of the music and chanting group Sati Gata, a band that integrates Buddhist-oriented chanting and songwriting into eclectic indie folk sound. In his last semester at Harvard, he taught a class called Enlightenment. Enlightenment, Horizons of Human Potential and Flourishing. So lots to talk about. Really excited to have you here. But first question, very important, Chris. Why do you think Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce make such a great couple?
I have no idea. I think, well, there's something perhaps, not knowing much about that particular situation, what I have sort of picked up on little sound bites, it sounds like there's an attraction there and there's a chemistry between them. Beyond that, I have no idea.
I see you clearly didn't prepare for this podcast, Chris. I'm very upset. So that's our homage to Between Two Ferns. We won't do any more questions like that.
After that introduction, I think we're done.
We're done. All right. Okay. For real. Honestly, you have such an interesting story. And I think I mentioned this in your intro. I met Chris because I was a student in his class at Harvard. One of the classes you teach is on mindfulness, and we really hit it off. And I think that I would love to hear, just maybe share with the audience a little bit about kind of how you came to this world of, becoming an academic, a meditation teacher, a chaplain. Where did that all start for you?
Good question. I would put all of this down to my meditation teacher, Leslie, who I met, in quotes, in 1996, who just kind of changed my entire worldview about what was possible. And, I come from a very highly intellectual academic family. I rejected education and intellectualism and all of that when I was younger. And it wasn't until I actually discovered meditation practice that it's suddenly everything started falling into place.
How old were you?
I was in my early 20s and early to mid 20s, actually. And I'd been in the music business for many years. I was co-owner of a production company in New York City, a music production company, and was just feeling existentially vacant with the whole industry, with the creative process. And so when I met this teacher, all of a sudden, it kind of rocked my world, right? It showed me that there was another path that I could follow. At the time, I was experiencing anxiety, depression, all kinds of other things that I just didn't know what to do with. And I found that meditation was just this amazing kind of revelatory way of feeling different in the world. And so that began the path. That was man.
Wait, that was New York? You were in...
I was in Manhattan at the time, but I had gone back to California, where I'm from originally, to visit some friends. And this is where I encountered the teacher. So I ended up moving from New York to California with my then wife, my spouse at the time. And that began this whole journey of exploration, into religion, psychology, Buddhist and Hindu traditions, Western forms of mysticism, all of these things, including psychology, which I minored in psychology as an undergrad.
Was it like, and who was your teacher again? What was her name?
Leslie Temple Thurston.
Leslie Temple. Did she ever write anything, or?
She has a book called The Marriage of Spirit. And now she's had some cognitive decline, dementia. So she's not actively teaching anymore, although her presence is still really powerful, still very much profound. And I still consider her a teacher of mine. And I think it was because of that, this capacity she had to unlock the potential in my heart, of my mind, of my, I would say, spirit and soul, but as a Buddhist, I can't really sort of make that as a permanent fixture, but really just opened me up quite a bit spiritually, to the point where I thought, I need to follow this path. And then I began studying academically religion, psychology. I went to Harvard for my graduate work, and really found how important it was that my realizations on the path were put into practical use in some way. It's not, in other words, it wasn't enough just to sit on a meditation cushion and go, hey, this feels great. I feel free from all of my inner turmoil. But it was really a matter of saying, okay, now how do I bring this into the world? How do I actually make a difference and basically get off the cushion with all this stuff? And so, I mean, I credit all of that to that original nexus that Leslie gave me. And one of the most joyful moments of my life was telling her on the telephone, was thanking her and extending deep gratitude, because without those original experiences, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now.
Do you remember the first kind of moments? Do you remember, like, it's interesting. A lot of people, and I know you talk about this in your Enlightenment class. There's some talk about the use of psychedelics, for example, and where that's going. And a lot of people that I've met, their first connection to, other states of consciousness is through that realm.
Yeah.
But for you, can you remember back to the first time where you experienced your consciousness shift through meditation? Is there any story that jumps out at you from your time with Leslie?
Yes. Yeah. It was frightening.
Tell us about it.
So, part of it, and I think this speaks to the experiences a lot of people have when you start deconstructing this sort of forward-facing and outward-focused sense of personality, identification, thoughts, the pathways that we use to see the world, experience it in a coherent way, start to unravel a bit when you start tapping into these deeper layers of consciousness that are largely formless. And so at the time, the sense of personality began to dissolve into what now I understand as this term Shunyata, or what is poorly translated as emptiness. It's really more so an experience of profound openness without content. It's an awareness that is full and yet has no form to it. And so the first time that happens, the first time that I really noticed this, all of a sudden I thought, where am I?
Where were you when that happened? Was this like, had you been studying for a while? Was it like a week of practice? Did it happen for you right away?
Yeah, not right away. It was probably about a year or so into it. And I just dropped into that space. It happened when I wasn't trying to facilitate any kind of state at all. And boom, there it was.
Were you like in a meditation class, or it was just you were walking around?
I was actually practicing. I was in meditation at home. This was in California. And, it was like, where did I go? I disappeared. And almost immediately I came back. I reified this notion of reconceptualizing who is Chris suddenly returned in that fear response. And this is part of, one of the things I write about and I teach about is something called an extinction burst. This is actually a clinical term that psychologists use sometimes for people experiencing panic disorder or anxiety disorders, where your fear will peak, it will start rising. Anybody who's had anxiety knows this feeling. You start out feeling uneasy. Yeah. Your body contracts, your heart rate maybe starts to speed up a bit. And on your way to a panic attack, these symptoms are just like continually increasing until you hit a peak where the fear is at its highest. And that usually happens right before you sort of relax a little bit. And that peak is called an extinction burst. Now, the next peak isn't far behind if you have sort of panic attacks.
Does it go like it goes up and then it comes back down and then it goes up higher?
Sometimes it might, yeah.
Jeez.
And so what I've done is adapt that process to meditation practice and say, this is exactly what the ego does sometimes in meditation practice, where, it doesn't want to die. No part of us wants to die. And so the ego itself, as a process, not as a thing, but as a process that reifies this sense of self and needs certainty, and it needs this kind of self-grasping. It's natural. It's not necessarily anything wrong with it, but it protects itself. And so when we disappear, all those fears, it's a similar process as the extinction burst. The ego peaks out and tries to draw us back in. And so part of the key in meditation practice is not taking the bait, because just around the corner is a deepening of your meditation, is an opening. And the ego knows. It's like, wait a second, we're right at the edge of the cliff. Let's jump back, as opposed to let go.
So you're saying like so you're sitting in meditation, you start to feel the dissolving of the sense of self, the dissolving maybe of the boundaries of your body, the dissolving of the sense of I, so to speak, and that's suddenly a very scary feeling that comes for people, or for yourself in this case. And then I'm assuming what you're now saying is that's actually the sign that you're on the right track, and you want to keep going through that. So I'm curious, does that happen to you? Like, can you make that happen at will? Or is that the kind of thing where it's kind of like this gift, that happens unbidden, like maybe the first time when you're not thinking about it, it just happens. But after this many years of meditation, what's your relationship with that sort of practice? Is that something that you can initiate?
It's happening right now.
The Travis Kelce question got you.
Well, no, I mean that with a certain number of years of practicing and finding that not to be scary, but freeing, you start seeing that this is the underlying nature of awareness. It's never that far away. It's always subtly present. And so just with that reminder, and basically this is what mindfulness helps with, is remembering, which is the meaning of sati, or the translation of the Pali term sati or smriti in Sanskrit, which translates directly as memory or remembering. Yeah. And it's that remembering, part of that remembering is, this is who I am, or in a Buddhist way, this is who I am in a non-conceptual way, where I don't need to fill the mind with all the beautiful glitter of this life, as well as all the suffering, but I can just rest in this place. It's always there. It's there now. It's there in you. I see it.
but if it's so, I'm following you. It's interesting. I think sometimes there's different ways of experiencing reality. And I don't know if it's what our brainwaves are doing or whatnot, where I'm trying to follow you, what you're saying intellectually.
Right.
And then there's another part of me that's like, let me just sink into this moment and let's sink into what the truth of those words would actually mean. Right.
And in the sinking in, there's an equal and opposite reaction of sinking back out to understand. And so, when we practice, we're always kind of floating in that liminal space. Well, not always, but part of the process of getting there is going, wait, what is happening now? There's that analytical mind. Once we relinquish altogether that kind of needing to know, we start having more visceral experiences, deeper sense of that is sometimes called metacognitive awareness. I call it metaconscious awareness because it's no longer cognitive. It's now in the realm of consciousness. And just to get back to what you mentioned about psychedelics, because I realized I never really addressed that part of it. One of the things that psychedelics can do is help facilitate that dissolution of the coherence that the mind, the brain needs to put together in order to function in the world in certain ways. And so there is this sense of this term entropy of the mind, or dissolution of the mind, of the coherence, in order to have a much more unbounded experience. So psychedelics, especially hallucinogenics, do that for us. They kind of take that function of the mind gathering things together into a coherent way of seeing that is largely cognitive. It also can be affective, emotions, feelings are in there. And what happens is that entire process will sort of shape new information coming in to conform to those neural pathways. In other words, we tend to basically construct reality based on the coherence we've already established in the brain.
Right.
What psychedelics do is it says, let's disorganize that whole thing.
Right.
Let's actualize, the right brain, which is the creative part of the brain that is just, it's the spiritual creative side. And the left brain doesn't know how to make sense of it anymore. That can be scary for some people.
Yeah.
Which is why I don't know if you've seen any of Michael Pollan's work called Changing Your Mind, but one of the interesting things the points that he makes in that documentary is that people who are doing psychedelics for things like anxiety, depression, sometimes they'll have an experience of panic that overwhelms them, and it makes sense,
right?
Because you're taking away this way of knowing that you've relied on. And often there are coping mechanisms in there. How do I keep from freaking out from day to day? By, distracting myself, by just fixating on social media or eating or whatever it might be, food.
Right.
And now I'm taking even those things are deconstructed. So you can see how, the use of psychedelics can be really helpful to move us beyond those limitations. And yet it has to be done in a way where the people who are helping and facilitating really know the terrain and can help you, again, not take the bait of the dissolution and keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. The whole reason, by the way, that we even met was that I was considering going into psychedelic chaplaincy. For me, psychedelics were an entry point into kind of spiritual practice when I was very young. And then when I got into real yoga and meditation, doing psychedelics was like way too much. I didn't need it anymore.
Right.
But I do feel for many people whose mind has hardened, who like their views of reality are so hard, that having that be deconstructed before they die would be very freeing for some people. I'm curious, you being at Harvard, what is the community and vibe like when it comes to psychedelic therapies and whatnot? I mean, Harvard was the original home of the psychedelic project, for those that don't know. I don't know if you have any good stories about from there.
Well, I wasn't around at that time, not at Harvard anyway. But yeah, there is a legacy. And by the way, the people who were involved in that were also kicked out. So eventually. And
what's the vibe like at Harvard now when it comes to, because they really did say, like, we're not doing this
for
many years. But there are a couple I don't know if it's professors or who's doing the work in psychedelics right now there.
Well, so I can speak on two fronts here. And one is that at Harvard Divinity School, there is a movement to establish a psychedelic chaplaincy orientation. And so I've been in dialogue with particularly our Buddhist students. So I'm also the denominational counselor to our Buddhist students on campus. And there's a great interest in exploring not just the merits of psychedelics, but also what Buddhism has to say about this precept of not taking intoxicants.
Right. Is it an intoxicant?
Huh?
Does Buddhism have I mean, in yoga, it's in the verse in Kaivalya Pada, it says you can achieve samadhi through the use of herbs and, drugs essentially. But in the Buddhist tradition, has it always been that there is a longstanding thing against the use of herbs or drugs?
Yeah, I mean, it's not cut and dry, for one thing. But the reason that lay Buddhists will usually observe 5 precepts or 5 restraints. One of them, and monastics even more so, one of them is not to be taking intoxicants. And it's not a moral judgment. It's not like this is wrong for any reason, but it's cause and effect. It's that by taking intoxicants, you're actually dulling the capacity to be clear, in a state of clear awareness. So you always, in order to remain on the path, want to maintain clarity, sharpness, high acuity of awareness and mind, so that you're not dulling that or being misled by projections that aren't authentically from your own capacities.
Do you know do you know historically the word that they use for intoxicants? Was it specifically relating to alcohol, or was it, would it be relating to social media? Like, what is the word that in Sanskrit that it was actually?
I'm not sure. That's a good question. I'd have to go back to the text, but there is a story of a monk who, in the Buddhist time, who was so powerful that he dispelled the demon, this horrible demon, out of this village. And out of gratitude, some of the villagers wanted to give him an offering of their thanks, of their gratitude. And they asked some of the other monks, if we bring this monk, and I wanted to say it was like some kind of wine or beer or something. I'm not positive what it was. But they kind of wanted to play a joke on this person. And so they said, sure, go ahead and give it to him.
The monks wanted to play a joke. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. On their pier. And of course, as a monastic, you're really charged with receiving whatever people give you.
Right.
Of course, he took all of the alcohol in, got stone cold drunk, right? And ended up passing out. And the Buddha comes along and sees him lying there and says, is this not the one who dispelled the demon from this town? And he said, yes, it is. And he said, well, why is he lying there? What's going on? So they tell him, and of course they're probably embarrassed and like, yeah, we probably shouldn't have done that. Well, now he can't even dispel a caterpillar from the road. Like, and so, I mean, that story, it's meant to be funny, right? In the Buddhist text. But it's also meant to make a point, which is the second you start dulling your consciousness, your mind, it's hard to know. It's hard to have clear discernment.
Yeah, you can go from hero to zero pretty quickly.
Right. Now, that said, There's another view that the Dalai Lama has put forth, and other Buddhists have said, look, your fundamental nature as awareness cannot be impacted by chemicals. So if you, and I myself have experienced this, if I've had too much wine or, one too many beers, because I do drink alcohol, I can usually make that buzz just disappear by dropping into awareness. And then I can drive home and I know that I'm clear and that, I'm not going to be weaving on the road, which I don't do often. I don't want your listeners to think that this is
if you want to be able to drive after drinking, you must be a Buddhist master.
Well, yes, it helps. So, a lot of it is context, but again, it's about cause and effect. Now with psychedelics, it's a whole different question because often, those of us who talk about the use of psychedelics and spirituality are acknowledging that they happen and should happen in an ecosystem that includes ritual, it includes guidance, it includes people who have known the path, know the terrain, know the pitfalls, and are really there for you to put your trust in. Either that or just doing it as part of, if you're familiar with the substance you're using, doing it as part of a ritualized system, which is how plant medicine has been used throughout history until we began using it for recreational experiences, what we call recreational use. So I think there's merit.
Well, at Harvard right now, do you know anyone who has a lab or anything? Or no, I guess they're not doing studies, right? They're just doing,
there are studies being done. Research is actually being done. It's also being legalized for research purposes around the country. There is a ketamine clinic at the Faulkner Hospital, which is a Harvard medical hospital here in the Boston area. And the chaplain at this hospital, I recently met with her, and we talked about how chaplains can be part of this. How can they support patients either at the end of life or, who are using ketamine for overcoming things like depression and such. So it's really a new field. It's a new field in general in the clinical world, and it's a new field in spiritual care support for people who are going into chaplaincy and end of life care. So we're having these conversations and seeing, how we can actually make possibilities responsibly accountable to due diligence and best practices and all of that. So,
and I think Cambridge did, I don't know if they decriminalized or what the rule, there's some law that Cambridge and Somerville, I think you can take mushrooms or something first. I don't know. I don't want to quote myself on this, but there's definitely a movement towards local decriminalization to allow for these kind of things. So I'm curious, you mentioned earlier something about like your feeling of a sense of soul or spirit. And then you said something like, Buddhism, we don't go there in Buddhism. What do you, can you speak to that a little bit? Like, do you believe you have a soul? If we don't have a soul, what is being reincarnated in? Is reincarnation real? I'd love to hear your personal beliefs as well as what Buddhism teaches.
Yeah, and not all Buddhists believe in reincarnation or what we call transmigration, which is that we somehow, there's a part of us, a very subtle part of us that is imprinted that then when the body dies, we then are reborn into a new life over many, many, many lifetimes. Now, the Buddha himself wasn't concerned when he was asked about past lives, future lives. He said, don't focus on that. In a way, it's a red herring. Focus on this life. Focus on your karma, on the tendencies that you know about in this life, because the karmas from past lives are so complex and intertwined that you really can just go get into the weeds very quickly with that. Nor can you know necessarily what will ripen and manifest in future lives. So you can do everything you can in this precious human birth that we have to simply do our best in this lifetime, to change our imprints that cause suffering, as much as possible. And so the path is laid out very clearly in Buddhism. Now, is there a soul? Is there not a soul? It's similar to the question that was asked of the Buddha: is there a God or is there not a God? And the answer depended on who was asking. And so if a person who was so convinced about their concept of the divine, of absolute reality, was real, he would say, no, there isn't a God. At least not in the way that you might think there is a God. But no, he would say, no, there isn't a God. But if an atheist asked him, he would say, yes, there is. So, I mean, part of that is he's not trying to be a wise guy here. He's trying to, help basically realize that, our concepts of things are largely illusory. And that ultimate reality exists fundamentally in paradox. And the truth is somewhere that holds both and neither. Which is beyond. It's that sort of meta-conscious awareness, not meta-cognitive awareness.
Meta-conscious awareness. I like that.
Yeah.
I think there's a real difference between meta-cognitive awareness and meta-conscious awareness.
Exactly. Me too.
What have you had any experiences that seemed as if you were experiencing a past life?
Probably when I was a child.
Like dreams or?
Dreams, and this is actually not uncommon for children to have images that are inexplicable to their birth, to the context of their birth or the setting.
Right.
Now, in Tibetan Buddhism, this is recognized as being really important. This notion that also enlightened masters are reincarnated and come back in order to continue teaching for the benefit of all beings, and that sometimes children are born and they will attach to a particular place they've never been to. Maybe they will pick out objects that belong to a master who died, maybe a few years before or even sooner. But like a recognition. Oh, I know who that is. That is so-and-so, even naming people. So it's pretty remarkable. I've known people who've witnessed this, and I trust them. So yeah, I do believe in that. I also have done a lot of practice and a lot of work in and around death meditation and Bardo practices from largely the Vajrayana tradition. In fact, I just co-led a retreat at Wonderwell Mountain Refuge in New Hampshire with a couple of colleagues doing Bardo practice.
What is Bardo? Yeah, what is that?
So Bardos are basically, Bardo literally means in between. These are transitional states that we move through. And there seem to be 6 Bardos that we go through. And this life is a Bardo. This life is a transitional state. It's something that we're moving through. Then, the Bardo of dying is another transitional state.
What are the 6 Bardos? Can you quickly kind of?
Yeah. So life, this life that we live, dying. Then there's the Bardo of Dharmadhattu, which is for people who haven't been on the path or haven't trained, happens very, very quickly. And in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, this is the belief that directly after corporeal death, when the body dies, that there is an immediacy in which our true nature is revealed to us in a flash of light, basically.
Instant enlightenment, so to speak.
It's not enlightenment, but it's the source of enlightenment. It is this flash of what is called the clear light, or rikpa is a Tibetan term for this, where that true nature is just shines. And then the next thing you know, you're in the next, and that is Bardo as well, the Bardo of the clear light, or Bardo of Dharmadhattu. And then you move into the Bardo of becoming, which is now you are, the substrate of your consciousness is preparing itself to be reborn. into the next life. And then there's the Bardo of birth, of actually being born into a new life. And so this
you mentioned really quick that the Bardo of self, seeing the light, so to speak, right after death, that happens very quickly for people who are non-practitioners. Is it possible for yoga or meditation practitioners to experience that?
Exactly.
Before dying?
You train with that. There are various techniques that you can train with, basically to practice dying, so that when that Bardo of Dharmadhattu, that clear light, is sort of becomes apparent or surfaces in a very vivid way, that you can slow it down and you can spend time. You can hang out in that space as an experience of curating, cultivating the enlightened mind, so that in your next rebirth, you're reborn in a much deeper, higher, wider, sort of more luminous plane. And one of the ways that people train to do this is, the death meditations. You practice dying, basically. There's also something called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, or the Bardo Todo in Tibetan, that is read to people to guide them through this entire practice, as everything from this life is basically falling away. Not to be frightened, keep going, and when you recognize the luminous quality, let yourself just really merge into that. So those Bardos really are seen to be practical in many ways for us to continue being reborn and continuing to help ease suffering in the world in whatever way is possible. Now, the masters who train to do this, they can hang out in this space for quite a while. And I've known people who've been involved in some of the studies that were done on these monks, who have measured heart warmth for up to 2 weeks after death, and this is empirically verified. I think Herbert Benson may have done some of those studies. I'm not sure if he's the one that did some of those studies, but basically this practice can lead to really slowing it down to such a level where you can just kind of take your time, but this has been documented.
That would kind of lead to that argument of like that there is like an actual soul or something that lives inside the heart. My teacher.
There is consciousness. There is a degree.
But is consciousness Purusha or Prakriti? Is it? In other words, is consciousness dual? Is it beyond the
great
nature of reality, or is it somehow corporeal in some energetic way?
Yeah, that's a great question, because different traditions will answer it differently. So, for example, the yogic philosophy has come out of the prior philosophical framework called Samkhya. Samkhya really sort of was the benefactor of yoga in more of a dualistic sense, that Prakriti, or nature, matter, right? The constituents of matter arise out of an imbalance of the gunas, right? Rajas, Sattva, and Tamas. That when they are in perfect balance, then you have a realization of Purusha. And so, in a way, yes, there are these two principles of sort of the female essence, right? Which is Prakriti, nature, and Purusha, which is pure consciousness. And I think BKS Iyengar talks about this quality of Purusha within us is the seer. The seer is that vibrant, clear, open consciousness, luminous, that is drawn through practice to the source of that seer. Right? So even asana is about getting in touch with that vitality, with the energies, and so on. So what we're talking about here is a continuum from gross to subtle. We're talking about consciousness having extremely subtle quality, refined, all the way into a gross level experience where we have matter. And so where we are in that continuum, as we cultivate mind through meditation and such, is sort of returning back to that most refined subtlety of mind. Advaita Vedanta, however, is a more non-dual, really sort of sees non-duality as kind of the essence, as does Vajrayana Buddhism, which is the tantric Buddhist practices that I do. It's really about non-duality, that ultimately that quote unquote seer is the fundamental non-dual nature of mind. That is the microcosm of the great macrocosm of the what we might call the Buddhafield in the cosmos, which is just a conceptual term. What's that?
Who said that term, the Buddhafield?
Well, I call it that. I don't know who has said it, but
I wonder. I love that term. You should trademark that. Just kidding, but
we're all part of it. No one can trademark that.
Yes.
Actually, the Sanskrit term would be Dharmadhattu.
Dharmadhattu. So is that the same? Are you familiar with the works of Alan Watts at all?
Yeah, a bit. Yeah.
You know, he has this book called The Book, and he gives a talk a lot about how all of us are all consciousness is really in reality one consciousness. Mm-hmm. You know, broken up into individual consciousness. So he'll say it in a fun way. He'll say, you know, God was bored and he decided it would be fun to experience everything. So he split itself up into infinite individual consciousness.
That's a good accent you got there.
The whole game of life is remembering that that's what we're up to, you know. And I love that story because as simple as it is, I think that, you know, the concept of soul, like the feeling of a homecoming, when your consciousness has this experience of letting go of the individual, you know, letting go of the Andrew, letting go of the ego, or whatever, letting go of the self, the small self, and returning to this bigger thing that is everything. That I think for some people, when they have that experience, it's like, oh yeah, of course, that's my soul, or this and that. And then they start thinking about religious thoughts and all these different ideologies they could believe, right? Maybe they go back to the ideology they had when they were kids, whatever religion that was, or they're curious and they're reading this text or that text. But in most ideologies, or not most religious texts, there's a lot of like apologetics to kind of explain how things work. And they're often, it will have holes in them. And so I'm always looking for ways of explaining reality that are logically consistent, if that makes sense. And that example of Watts that he gave, where we are all just God playing a game of hide and seek, and the purpose of the game is to remember that you're God. To me, it's logically consistent with, you know, all these questions about reincarnation and this and that. I'm curious if do you struggle with those kind of things when you're in your practice of Buddhism, or in your kind of relationship to spirituality in general?
No.
And why is that? Is it because you don't care about why is that?
It's not a matter of not caring. It's a matter of discerning futility from what is the most beneficial, experiential way of knowing ultimate reality. And that's not always going to conform to a logical rationality where everything fits together intellectually, because part of the endeavor here is to really embrace paradox. If we can't embrace paradox and see that there is a part of me in which all paradoxes are simply apparent paradoxes. There are no real paradoxes. Only the rational mind sees paradox, because it can't know what it doesn't already know. And so it tries to make sense out of what it has. And the mind can't hold, this is now we're talking about ordinary mind, it can't hold the entirety of reality. This is why the deconstruction matters, why we begin to loosen our views of the worlds, of the world and worlds in ways that quote unquote make sense, and have a deeper, more open experience, as Alan Watts says it, of unity consciousness. This is a term that Leslie coined often. Unity consciousness is not just, again, metacognitive, but it is metaconscious.
Metaconscious. And that's so would you agree then that kind of spiritual practice or whatever it is that we're doing here, or truth even, is not just metaconscious in a sense that truth claims can't really be made just at the intellectual level,
right?
And that
not ultimate truths. Yeah,
ultimate truths can really only be experienced at a metaconscious level.
Yeah, and beyond. Yeah, and I think, in Buddhism there's this notion of conventional reality and ultimate reality. And conventional reality, or relative knowing, is actually very useful to get us to realize ultimate reality, where there is no form, which is just an immediacy of reality just as it is, what in Zen is called suchness, with no content, no filter, no projecting, just all is as it is, through clear awareness. Otherwise, we get into the dilemma of the hiker who goes climbing all the way up to the top of this mountain and is hanging off of this cliff, and the guru is sitting right there and says, "I'm disillusionment. Enlightenment is over there." And so then the hiker goes, "Oh my gosh, okay." So climbs down and then goes over to the next mountain, works his way all the way up, and the same thing happens. It's it's that we put so much effort into it, and we go looking here, there, and everywhere. But ultimately, what this hiker needs to see is that he doesn't have to necessarily keep seeking for it out in those mountains.
Right. The seeking is
all these different gurus. It's something that he's looking for out here, So that is, those different mountains are kind of the different concepts and different disillusionments, or false refuges, as Tara Brach calls them, the great sort of Buddhist author and teacher Tara Brach. False refuges can look like a true refuge. They can look like things. This is why, you might have a master that is not enlightened. In other words, they have mastered practices. They know how to generate an energy, a sensibility, a quality that is quite magnetic and quite dazzling, but they haven't really fully extinguished their ego, or not extinguished, but transformed their ego in service of others, and then they get into trouble.
Do you think that those masters haven't actually truly experienced dissolution of the ego, or did they experience, what is it that those folks are missing? What is it that all the gurus that got into trouble with, were they fraudsters from the start?
I don't think so.
Were they missing something? Because so many of them speak such beautiful, eloquent.
Of course. It's complex because, these are still human beings, and they are still in a form, and they are still, to some extent, there are egoic residues that tend to fragment the person.
But could it also be that their enlightenment, I'm just playing the devil's
Sure.
advocate here.
Mara. In Buddhism, the devil's advocate would be Mara.
Yeah. Couldn't it be that they're just, they've already gone beyond? And so, why do they have to have what their views of morality and things could be one where, they're looking at life in lifetimes and they're and cause and effect, and they're not necessarily holding themselves to the ethical standards that kind of general society
You know, that would be fine if their students were also equally enlightened. But the fact is that immediately there's a power differential between the master and the student gets ensnared in an ecosystem in which they are at risk for harm by the teacher.
But I agree with you, but given the thing we've just talked about, like, what real harm is that? If that harm is leading them to maybe stop being bound by that teacher,
it's
or
that they're not understanding sort of their own power differential, and they're not understanding the harm they're causing the person. This is why you have people who are abused, traumatized. Certain elements of personalities of some of these teachers that come out are really quite aggressive and really abusing the power for their own means. And yet it's cloaked. Ooh, this is a practice that will help enlighten you if we exchange this energy. You know, here's a tanka on my wall, something called yabyum, which is a very, very specific sexual practice where the woman is straddling the Buddha or the being, right? And sometimes that's used to say, you too can experience this non-duality by unifying with me. Now, here's the thing. Usually, people who do this and who agree to do this, to consent to do this, are far along on the path. So if the teacher, whether the teacher is a male or a female or, you know, or binary, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's that it's that the people who are getting caught up with these teachers, they don't understand what they're getting into. And when you're in an insular community out in the mountains somewhere in a retreat or what have you, you're not sort of in a frame of mind where you're going to go against what the teacher says. And this is why teachers themselves have come out and said, yep, this was, I fell off the wagon, I fell off the path, I caused harm, and I'm sorry. They wouldn't be saying that if they hadn't gotten caught, right? And acknowledging their harm. And so this is why, like, one of the things at Harvard Divinity School that we talk about, also in the Buddhist classes, on leadership and all of that, is really fully understanding the power dynamics and boundary, how important boundaries are between teachers and students. Now, this is particular, I think, to what we might call predatory teachers, that where this is like a serial process. It happens over and over.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, this is so common. I mean, in every power dynamic, especially spiritual ones, you know, whether it's in Christian churches and in Buddhist groups, in yoga groups, yoga, there's a huge Me Too awareness that happened. And I think, I guess the question I have, I think, by the way, you go ahead, continue. It's awesome that Harvard is kind of teaching spiritual leaders how to be aware of this.
Yeah.
I do think, though, that most of the spiritual leaders out there that are teaching, like, that are doing these amazing practices, the masters, you called them before, they're not going to go to Harvard Divinity School to be told,
exactly,
you know, how to be ethical.
Nor should they all do that either. It's not for everybody, but
like,
you know, the thing is accountability.
Yeah.
That the teacher that no longer is accountable to anyone. Now the ego goes, look what I can do with this. In a very refined way.
So that's what you're saying happens, that when the teacher gets to a point where their ego subconsciously feels that they're not accountable to anyone, it starts to go, oh, let me go try that out, you're saying?
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm still a human being. I have needs. You know, it's also kind of interesting how some of these teachers are actually married when they commit these infidelities, and will seduce married people who didn't sign on for these higher tantric practices. It's purely that residual egoic thing. Now, it's a different thing, I think, if somebody maybe falls in love, right? And it becomes something that is, I hate to use this term, a one-off thing. That's maybe not the best term to use, but you know, and there are teachers who have actually gotten into long-term committed relationships with people that were part of the community, and it becomes a public thing. It becomes, oh, you know, they're, you know, that can be fraught too, but it doesn't have to be toxic. It doesn't have to be, you know, the power dynamic between the two changes in those moments.
Do you think the bigger is it the bigger the spiritual community becomes, the more likely there is going to be kind of unethical transgressions?
I don't know. I don't know if size, you know, has an impact. Size of the community really matters there. Yeah, it's hard to say, and I really don't know what the data says about all those things. But I think it's likely possible in any context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For anyone watching, I'd be very wary of any spiritual teacher offering Shiva Lingam practices, or what were you saying before? Do you have a statue or something that you're pointing to? We can't see it on the screen.
I don't have one with me. No, I don't carry one around.
Okay.
The yabyum. You see it on tankas, on sometimes on the you know, the paintings, the tapestries that sort of portray the male and the consort.
Right. I mean, do we live in too, you know, are we being too prude then in that estimation of, like, you know, bringing sex practices into spiritual practices? Like in Taoist tradition that I studied, there's a whole history, you know, sex healing is a practice. I mean, but it depends on who you read. They say, you know, it should be done with your wife, or, you know, with your partner. You know, someone that's like a guru of those things and teaching lots of people. I don't think we have that in our culture today. In ancient India, do you know, or like, was that kind of like part of the culture? Like, are there like these spiritual brothels that existed, kind of thing?
Yes, actually, and what we now call escorts or prostitutes were sometimes for that benefit. And in some instances, those prostitutes themselves were practitioners.
When was this historically, or what are you referring to?
I'm talking about sort of maybe the early Middle Ages, where Tantra and Buddhism began to sort of unify. So, I mean, we know that a lot of these, Buddhism didn't arrive into Tibet until Padmasambhava brought it. I believe it's in the 8th century or something. Yeah, 8th century. It had gone to China a couple of hundred years before that, 6th century with Bodhidharma. But along then, it took a little time for, you know, some of the other practices that were classically Hindu, like the tantras of the Vaishnavas and the Shaivite traditions, to actually also integrate with the shamanic tradition that was there in Tibet before Buddhism. So you have this confluence of influences around then. But yeah, there are stories also in China of the wine-drinking, meat-eating monks who also had lots of sex. And part of the rationale there was that their practice was so strong that they could do it and not become attached.
Yeah.
And so I think that this period around that you're talking about in China, in the Taoist sense, those were there as well. Also in the Vajrayana traditions that use the psychophysiology of the body, the energies, or in yoga, maybe what we would call ojas, you know, the vitality, the vital energy within sexual fluids is actually really important in some traditions for manifesting the bliss of enlightenment. Now, there's a catch to this, and that is there is no release of those.
Right. In the Chinese traditions, you're not supposed to release your sperm.
There's no orgasm. There is a buildup of that energy, and then you circulate it through the body. And in Buddhism, and I've done a little bit of that practice where you circulate it into the heart, and you actually energize the heart to be more compassionate. And it's really profound. Yeah. But if you release the fluid, you're basically releasing, this is the idea anyway, you're releasing all of that vitality, all of that energy that you've built up. And so it gets very tricky, and that's why it's a very specific esoteric training. But it's not, you don't have to do this to be enlightened either. It's one way, right? To use the passions, to use the things of this world, right, and master them, basically, overcome and turn it into the lotus from the mud, basically. I just have to plug in my computer here.
No worries. I think, I mean, I would just say from personal practice as well, a personal experience, that holding in your, you know, conserving your ojas, as we say in yoga, which is basically holding in your sperm for men. It has a profound effect. To me, it's a noticeable effect on my meditation practice, on my vitality, and I'm pretty sure there's a measurable. I'm pretty sure there's a measurable effect, like of all kinds of chemicals and whatever in the body, because I know so many different athletes do that too.
Right, right. It's a conservation and a reclamation of powerful energy in the subtle body and in the physical body.
So let's go. Well, let's see if we can go into one more kind of topic. You know, just looking at my little list of questions here. I guess, what do you think is the most important practice or habit or shift of perspective that you would recommend for just any old person to bring them more consciousness, or bring them towards a more enlightened way of being?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of answers to that. And one is is perhaps to trust our benefactors who have brought us things like mindfulness, the simpler practices that are gateways into wanting to know more. One of the things I've learned teaching, you know, like the course that you took at the Extension School on mindfulness, meaning, and resilience, is, you know, we start with mindfulness as fundamentally from the Buddhist teachings, the 10th discourse. We read the text and create the context for what's possible without naming what it is, but just sort of the presupposition that something simple like mindfulness is a path that will continue to unfold, and it'll be there through your lifetime. So part of it is knowing that there is something really important here that can teach me more about myself. It's not about, this speaks also to the question of the masters and the teachers. A good teacher will help you learn more about yourself than you learn about them, right?
Yeah.
That's one way to tell, you know, if a teacher is actually has the right motivation.
Are you more interested in the teacher, or are you more interested in yourself? Are you more interested in yourself?
And a lot of people are coming to these things wounded with very low self-worth, and it's hard to think, oh, maybe I have this potential.
Yeah.
And so it's taking the time to explore in simple ways things like your breathing. What can your breath teach you? And, you know, you'll be surprised what doors open, and also your curiosity as you find more inner resources to who you are that you didn't know that you have. The capacity to be still and peaceful when you've had a lifetime of diagnoses, anxiety, ADHD, whatever it is. And all of a sudden, oh, this is so natural. But we have to know how to get there. And this is what teachers are helpful for, is to help just say, you know, this is helpful. This is how the great teachers taught it for a reason. But taking a secular mindfulness course can do that, right? It can just sort of settle, relax. First, it's really about easing our own suffering initially. And I think so it's exploring something simple like mindfulness, and then also doing asana practice is also really helpful. If somebody, I know a lot of people who are spiritual, but they don't do anything with their bodies. And so there can be a disconnect, especially Buddhists. You know, in the Buddhist teachings, there's this notion that the second you're born, your body starts decaying and dying, and that it's not the point of practice. And yet the Buddha himself had, he was really well versed in the medical arts. There are
Did he
whole
do 6 years of hatha yoga too?
He might have. I don't know. I don't know what
Oh,
the Buddha's asana practice was like, but he was exposed to it because his teachers were yogis. You know, there was no Buddhism before that. He had all
right.
these, you know, amazing resources from tantras to and renunciation, yogic practices, the Upanishadic stuff. Anyway, we could certainly spend more time getting into that. But
I would like to though give a quick plug for your class on mindfulness at the Harvard Extension School. Anyone can take the class. You can, you know, I should say, when do you run that, by the way? That's in the...
It's in the fall. Yeah. So
fall.
there are 3 revolving courses. There's the mindfulness, meaning, and resilience class in the fall, every fall term.
Mm-hmm.
The spring term, what I'm doing now is compassion, science, and the contemplative arts. So we really go more into it's sort of part 2. And then we just ran the very first class at Harvard that I am aware of on Enlightenment in the fall. So we'll be running that again in the fall next year. These classes are always full. So if you might be interested, make sure you sign up early because they're always waitlisted. Yeah.
The mindfulness class, I will say, and I had been already a yoga practitioner for 20 years before taking this class. Reading the texts on mindfulness, exploring and thinking about the topics of impermanence, for example, like the philosophical part of that practice was so powerful for me.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, you mentioned is the one thing you'd recommend for people, I think, is kind of taking on maybe a mindfulness practice, whether that's in a secular sense or I do think the best way to take on a practice like that is to find a group that will kind of force you to go through it for a little bit, as opposed to just, you know, picking up an app or picking up a book. I mean, those things could help too, but I've always found that it really helps to have the Sangha or the community, whether that's at a class at Harvard Extension School or your local, you know, yoga or Buddhist Zendo or whatnot.
Right.
Yeah. What interests you most of all these subjects? What are you most excited about teaching?
I think enlightenment.
Yeah. Do you go into like a weird trance when you're teaching, or do you have to like stick?
Well, sometimes, but usually it's because I haven't had enough sleep or enough coffee. No, no. I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I'm working on 2 books right now that really sort of frame the arc of my teaching, and one is the book on resilience. So, which is a part of the course that you took, sort of a new way of thinking about resilience theory. And so we draw on positive psychology and Western psychology and put that into dialogue with mindfulness and Buddhist psychology, and rethinking what we might call a resilient person. Because I think that there's been a lot lacking in mental health and in positive psychology that relativizes resilience to personality traits, to emotions. And so that's one of the things I'm working on, is a multi-tiered layer of different forms of resilience that are operating at different times in our lives. But it is much more nuanced, and how contemplative practice, loving kindness, mindfulness actually speak to resilience, and also sort of deeper feeling states that can sometimes be challenging, including trauma. So we do cover like trauma-sensitive mindfulness for people with a history of PTSD and trauma, which is really important to also go into. So I think all of that stuff is a passion. It's my research focus, as well as now shifting into states of consciousness, brain waves. So I've been getting more into trying to bring these teachings that we've had for thousands of years into some kind of coherence with neuroplasticity and some of the Western science, as well as quantum mechanics. So that's kind of where I'm moving with a lot of this work, and as well as the stuff on psychedelics, I'm finding really interesting. because it's important to so many people.
Mm.
Not just I find it interesting, but it matters to people that in their understanding. So I think these are all vehicles to help create more awareness.
Yeah. So, oh man, we don't have much time, but I do have one other question that just came that I don't know if we'll be able to get into it all the way, but in your class, we, when we were studying resilience, you had us read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. And I'll paraphrase here, but one of the things we kind of got from that was that when you have meaning, when someone has meaning or has purpose, it allows them to practice mindfulness in a way, because it gives them it creates resilience, number one. And then resilience in turn allows people to be more mindful. Instead of feeling like the world is just throwing you around like a pinball, you actually have a direction and you're able to direct your consciousness and whatnot. And for me, my own experience after having one of the deepest dissolutions of the ego, as you described it earlier in the podcast, after having that experience, the deepest I've ever experienced, having my ego be dissolved and then returning, I actually felt a very lack of direction and meaning, because when I experienced my ego dissolving so much and then coming back, I'm like, well, okay, then what is the point of anything? There was what do I do? There's nothing to do. I could just sit here forever, or I could, but it wasn't like I want to die or something like that. It didn't go to that. In fact, it was more like there was no desire to do one thing versus another. It was just to be aware of what's arising and then kind of follow that path. And it's like, well, I'm still in this Andrew body, still have kids and a wife and have some karmas, let me do those. Right.
That's the residual mind stuff.
Yeah. And that brought over time, I got brought back. I'm no longer in that state of consciousness where I'm feeling like nothing, the
relevance that this enlightened state or this enlightened quality has a purpose of some kind. Now, that's what you're saying, right?
How do we tie those two things together? Because if having a purpose gives us resilience and gives us the ability to be more mindful and but the state of experiencing enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, it dissolves all that. Is it then, is it just that the purpose gets changed to be more related to enlightenment? How do you resolve those two seemingly opposing ideas?
Yeah. And that is the question of the ages. And especially nowadays, that a lot of practitioners are trying to figure out, how do I integrate these things together in a way that makes sense? And I think, first of all, when we have those experiences, we're planting seeds. It's like cultivating a garden. And, the experiences that we have in meditation that are liberating, that are freeing and abstract, that feel like they have no groundedness in the real world, quote unquote. Those are seeds that are growing how we might have a really lush garden of perception. Our perception becomes more spacious about the world we're living in, not either or. And believe me, I've struggled with this too. At what point do I sort of check out of this, just incredibly busy life that I have, and just, go off and just practice and do things simply and help where I can and everything. And, it's just not time yet. I'm here to do these things we're talking about. My ex-wife used to say, are you sure you don't just want to go and become a monastic? Why are you still here doing all this? And I had no idea at the time, but I knew that the timing, I needed to be here in the world to keep going and not give up on family, on friends, friendships, clients, that kind of thing. And I think that is, we're all of us, I think, trying to figure out, what is my balance here? There is no universal answer or formula. We have to find that on our own. And that's, I think, why, these states of disillusionment, not disillusionment, dissolutionment, where we are dissolving certain parts of ourselves, actually provides a realization for how we can show up, how we can be more compassionate because of it, not instead of it or in spite of the world. In a way, it's like being in the world but not of it. And we're constantly challenged. In some ways, I think it's more difficult to be a practitioner that is in a family and raising children and working and needing to make money than it is to just say, I'm going to go and sit in a cave somewhere in the Himalayas or in the mountains of California. And, we're faced with challenges that are unprecedented, since a lot of what we're doing has traditionally been a monastic endeavor.
Right. The teaching of these practices. So
we are the instruments of that insight, and hopefully we're able to pass on, okay, here's how I have made meaning. We have this fundamental, this is the thing about Viktor Frankl, we have this fundamental need for meaningfulness. And yet we can also feel pressure to make meaning quickly, when in fact it can take more time to figure out. So we have to just be gentle with the process. Not regret that, oh my gosh, now I have to come off retreat and I have to do all this other stuff, because it can really feel like this extreme bifurcation of our lives. But I think somewhere in between, we're showing up in a way that is much more whole, much fuller, with a deeper presence, even if we don't feel it because we're distracted. We are different in the process. We are transforming nonetheless.
Yeah. Amen. I agree with that. Actually, I think that's well said. And, this is a good place for us to put a pin in things. There's so many more things I actually want to ask you about, but.
Well, I hope we can do this again. This has really been a wonderful opportunity.
For sure.
Yeah.
Totally. And we can, we'll have to do, we'll have a lot more things. We can talk about free will.
We
can talk about politics. We can talk about what to do in the world, yogis.
And one of the things that comes up often is I get asked, what do I do with my anger about the state of the world, about what's happening in the Middle East or, other places, our political system. And, one of the things that I am also working on is sort of socially engaged spirituality. How can we use contemplative practice to make a difference, including harnessing the power of our anger in skillful ways, in ways that speak truth to power, fierce compassion, that kind of thing. So maybe that would be a nice subject for another time as well.
Yeah. Would love to hear what you think on that. Cool. All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much. Like, this has been awesome. Yeah. Next time we go, let's go all into politics and dealing with the world that is.
Let's do it. Yeah, we'll touch those hot button issues.
Yeah, let's outro now, and thank you, everyone, and we'll catch you in the next one.
Everyone be well. Take care of yourselves and each other.